Why does everyone automatically assume that Sarah's laugh is the derisive chortle and snort of a skeptic? In my preparations for today's sermon, I kept coming up with commentary after commentary chiding Sarah for her lack of faith, her cynicism. One of them even referred to Sarah's reaction as the dismissive laughter of incredulity. The interpretation we have inherited is that of a defiant skeptic, folded arms, snorting air out her nostrils and rolling her eyes as she eavesdrops on the conversation between the visitors and her husband. A baby, at my age? Yeah, right. I say that and I'm not 80. I'm sure by now it comes as no surprise to you that I couldn't leave this interpretation alone. I simply wasn't satisfied that this was a fair representation of her character in this moment. Something wasn't sitting right about it. Childbearing is no laughing matter, especially if it's something you've pined for decades, to no avail. And I acknowledge that for some in the congregation today, this whole topic is going to strike a nerve. It would have for me 8 years ago. I was young, there was no reason why getting pregnant should have been a challenge, but it was. It took 1.5 years before I saw those 2 pink lines, before I heard the first sounds of her tiny fetal heartbeat. But in that time, in the waiting, when all my friends, and even here at Knox, everyone was having babies left, right, and center, there was something in the water and I kept drinking it like right out of the tap. Each negative pregnancy test became more and more gut-wrenching. God had made a promise to Abraham and Sarah that they would be the patriarch and matriarch of a great nation, that they would have children as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the beach. And even at the time that this promise was made to them, it felt pretty unlikely. They were both already well advanced in age. But by the time of today's story, she was almost 90, which is wild, considering the life expectancy wasn't much more than half of that. And childbearing for women would have started around 15 or 16 years old. Consider also that in that time period, childbearing was the way a woman established herself. It was her only currency in society. A woman was her father's property until she became her husband's property. Childbearing gave her a bit of clout, some worth and value. You were a blessing to your family if you had lots and lots of babies. If you became a widow, but you had sons, you would still be cared for into your old age. Without them, you could be abandoned by your family if no other male relative decided to bring you into his household. Sarah was somewhere over the 80-year mark. She had been waiting and hoping and praying for a child since her adolescence. Infertility wasn't a joke. It was the difference between life or death for a woman. Infertility still isn't a joke. Don't post it on Facebook on April 1st. Even though most people in the 21st century have evolved beyond seeing women as baby-making factories, it's not a laughing matter. Most women take the whole thing very, very seriously. Even if they're choosing not to have children, it's a very personal, very serious decision. In my heart of hearts, from one woman to another, I don't believe that Sarah laughed the laugh of a skeptic. And it's interesting that most of the commentaries that said she were written by men. In my heart of heart, I don't think she was laughing as a skeptic. I think she laughed the laugh of someone on the brink of tears. If I don't laugh, I'll cry. And we've all had those moments, haven't we? Where somehow the human heart protects its shattered state with this odd wave of humor. Your flight is delayed, you miss your connection, the next one's 10 hours away, so you're sleeping in the airport lounge, only to find out the next plane is overbooked. Sometimes a series of unfortunate events evokes this strange laugh out of us we don't quite understand. If I don't laugh, I'll cry. At an interment I did recently in our memorial garden, someone commented quite darkly how well the begonias are doing this year. We've had a lot of funerals at Knox this year. It's been a difficult year for us. I laughed a bit, awkwardly, but not because it was funny, because if I didn't, I would have burst into tears. Why? What is it about tragic situations that sometimes draws laughter out of us? It turns out science has an answer. Studies have actually been done on this phenomenon. Laughter, we know, releases endorphins, and endorphins make you feel good. They're quite literally homegrown morphine. It's why we feel so good after a good laugh, or runners experience a high. I had Piper with no medical assistance or no drugs. I had midwives. And there's a high after all that pain that you can't quite describe. Enough endorphin action, and you might even get some dopamine going in your body, which is that happiness you experience when you're eating your favorite dessert. But here's the thing about endorphins. They're triggered by pain. They're neurotransmitters produced as a response to certain stimuli, especially stress, fear, or pain. They interact mainly with receptors in cells found in regions of the brain responsible for blocking pain and controlling emotion. You didn't know you were going back to grade 10 biology today, did you? There is science behind why sometimes we laugh when we really ought to cry. The body literally protects itself from the pain, releasing its own morphine to numb the onslaught. And it is shocking to us when it happens. Sometimes we even feel embarrassed, don't we? I shouldn't be laughing about this. Have you ever laughed at something feeling it was totally inappropriate? I mean, maybe not if you're a sociopath, but far more likely is your body released endorphins to block your pain receptors and regulate your emotions so that you could actually push through the trauma of that moment, through the hurt, through the shock. It's part of our physical makeup, the way God knit us together, that we might laugh instead of cry. And I firmly believe that's what happened to Sarah that day. At almost 90 years old, overhearing that promise again that she would bear a child. She laughed because otherwise she'd cry. It was too painful to think about the years and years and years of trying, the disappointment, the frustration, the anger. There's no in vitro fertilization in those days. The resentment as everyone else around her, family, friend, even foe, conceived with ease. The ache in her body as she watched other women nurse their brood. The recollection of whispers and rumors that she must be cursed if she can't conceive. I think it's cruel. I think it's cruel to paint Sarah as a dismissive, faithless skeptic. She was a woman in pain. Which, if that's the case, I think it's a better explanation to her supposed lie. When the visitors confront her with her reaction, they ask Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh?" Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? But Sarah denied, saying, I didn't laugh, I didn't laugh, I didn't laugh. For she was afraid, probably embarrassed. He said, oh, yes, you did. You laughed. She was afraid because she didn't mean to laugh. It wasn't a joke. This wasn't slapstick comedy. It was the unexplainable laugh that comes from someone whose deepest wound has just been ripped open again. Oh, yes, you did laugh, the mysterious visitors insist. And if I'm reading this right, I don't believe they're chiding her. In fact, I think what has happened is that the Lord could see the depth of Sarah's pain in that moment. His precious daughter, the one who would be the mother of nations, now well beyond hope of ever being able to conceive, carry, or birth a child of her own. He saw her pain, yet is anything too wondrous for the Lord? And this, I think, is the climax of the story, the crux, the moment where the human and the divine meet. It's the primal question of God's people, the question that echoes in all our places of doubt and disbelief when we wonder at the promises of God. In this story, we have a powerful example of where humanity so often finds itself when it sits in God's presence, where we find ourselves all too often. Take a moment to consider all the promises of the new heaven and the new earth, all living creatures redeemed, a new resurrection, every tear wiped away, lions lying down with the lamb, streets paved with gold. And then I invite you to turn on the news. Look at stories of lives ripped apart by hurricanes and the Amazon engulfed in flame. Look at the panic and pain of parents and family members after yet another mass school shooting. Watch the horrors of migrants trying to escape dangerous lands for safer places, only to be drowned in the ocean or ripped apart from family members at the border and put in cages. Listen to the stories of pain and grief from rising mental health crises and addiction. Listen to the stories of families and communities still waiting for answers about the missing and murdered Indigenous women in our country. This is not the world we wanted to leave to our children or our grandchildren. Yet here it is. It's not a joke. Yet sometimes this weird phenomenon happens where we find ourselves laughing simply at the overwhelming pain of it all. A laughter of astonishment at the absurd disproportion between the divine promise and our human reality. And I believe, here's the good news, I believe God respects that. God saw Sarah's laughter, and I don't believe he chastised her. Her response was entirely human and not that surprising. People do not procreate in old age. She had lived a long life of disappointment and barrenness. God acknowledged her pain and at the same time proclaimed once again the promise and the hope. In a way, maybe what God was saying to Sarah was, look, I know it's hard to believe what I have promised. Everything about this seems topsy-turvy to the ways of the world. You did laugh, but that's okay. You're not the first nor the last to laugh at what seems impossible. But that doesn't mean it can't or won't happen. God did not shame Sarah in a punitive manner, quite the contrary. We read that the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Out of a barren aged womb, God brought life. Life out of death. A year later, Sarah bore a son, flesh of her flesh, bone of her bone. And in a delightful double entendre, they named their son Isaac, which in Hebrew means laughter, the carefree, joyous laughter of childlikeness, the contagious laughter that brings together strangers and friends, the laughter of hope and faith-fueled disbelief at the wondrous things God has done. The laughter that accompanies our astonishment at God's miracles, even in the midst of our pain, even in the midst of what we see as only death and despair. The laughter that will ring out through the valleys and hills of the new heaven and new earth. Isaac. Laughter. What's in a name? Sarah gets the last word in our story, which matters because women don't often get a word, let alone the last word in our stories. A prophet of our time. She said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in our old age. Who indeed could have seen this coming? Promising life where there is only death? Well, that seems utterly ridiculous, doesn't it? Laughable, even. Turns out, God has a sense of humor. To God be all the glory. Amen. I invite you to have a moment of quiet, and if I could frame it for you, if you'd like, I invite you to think about perhaps something in your life where if you don't laugh, you'll cry. That deep, cutting pain. And I invite you to just offer that to the Lord and see if you can hear any promises. Let's have some quiet.